We're going to dive into React now. So React is a library for building user interfaces. It is built in JavaScript. So under the hood, it is really just JavaScript. So we're going to move away from the way we've been authoring HTML and CSS and JavaScript to using a JavaScript first way of doing it, which means this React library will take care of, from our JavaScript, figuring out what HTML and CSS should be on the page. So React has a couple of useful properties that we can talk about at a high level. One is that it's declarative, which this will make more sense when we jump into code, but essentially you tell React, this is how I want the page to look at any moment in time, and React handles updating the elements on the page. You don't have to reach into the elements and change their style. You don't have to reach into the elements and bind click listeners. It's a more declarative syntax. You just tell React how the state should be. And it is also component-based. So we have kind of seen that we have these basic components in HTML. We have paragraphs, H1s, divs, we have images, and now we're going to be able to create these new components that wrap up a bunch of logic and wrap up a bunch of view that we can reuse in our application. So to see an example, there are a couple examples on the main page, and don't worry too much about the syntax, but here is a element that is being rendered to the page. This is a component. It looks a lot like the HTML we've been writing, where it has the name of the tag, and then it has an attribute and a value, except in React world, these are called properties, props. So this component is being put on the page, the name is set to Taylor, and then here's the declaration of that component. So it is a div with the word hello, followed by whatever that name property is. And this is what gets output to the page. So you could use this multiple times in your page and change the name each time you use it. This is kind of a toy example, but when we get into making our quiz game in React, we will have, for instance, a trivia item component that wraps up all the view, all of the HTML, and all of the logic for our individual trivia items in our game. A couple high-level concepts that are important to introduce before we sort of dig in. There's this idea of JSX, which is a way to author your HTML from JavaScript. It is a new syntax. It's an extension to the JavaScript language that is built for writing React. You don't have to use JSX when you are authoring your React components, but you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't. We'll get into the intricacies of this. I also want to show you a quick sandbox here. So this is a online sandbox for authoring code. It's called Code Sandbox, and I just grabbed one of the React templates and modified it slightly. So I don't want to get too bogged down in the syntax, but basically this does something that we have done before, where we have a click button that counts the number of times it's been clicked. And that is wrapped up in this component here. So it is less code than we have written before, and some of the way that it works is it mixes JavaScript with our HTML directly. So this is that JSX syntax. We see some familiar things like a div, an H1, an H2. We see a button, and then we have onClick passing in a function. So we are saying whenever this button is clicked, this is the function that should run. We don't have to do the document query selector, and we don't have to then add event listener to bind a function to a click event. We just say onClick and we pass in the function. And then here inside of our template for what the HTML should look like, we can just pass in a variable. So here we are taking this count variable and just inserting it directly into our markup for our page. And magically behind the hood, React is re-rendering this every time the count changes and giving us a reactive user interface. Okay, that is enough introduction. Let's make sure that we have the required software. So these were in the list of required software at the beginning of the semester on Canvas. So if you've already installed them, great. But I'll just remind you. So you need Node, which you can download here. The LTS version is fine. This works on Mac, Windows, Linux, and comes with something called NPM, which we'll talk about. And I would also highly encourage you to download Git Bash if you are on Windows, which is a terminal environment for Windows. If you are on Linux or Mac, you already have a terminal environment, so you don't have to download this. You can just use your default terminal. So high-level introduction to some of the tools. Node is a JavaScript environment that can run outside of the browser. So when we get into server-side programming, we'll actually be able to take our JavaScript code that we've been writing and use it to essentially build desktop applications that run on servers to bundle up all our server-side logic. But it's also a popular tool to use in front-end development when you need to take the code that you're writing and sort of process it in some way, or build or set up a build pipeline for your code, which is part of what we have to do because we are using JSX, but it's also a common thing to be done in general. So Node is a JavaScript environment outside of the browser that you can run on your desktop. And then that comes bundled with something called Npm, which is the Node package manager, which is a ecosystem and tool that allow you to pull in other pieces of code that people have written into your projects, or pull in command line tools like we will see momentarily. So we're going to use command line. So we're going to use a terminal window to run some software in this class going forward. So if you've installed Git Bash, you can open it up on your computer and you will get a window that looks something like this. This is a terminal environment and you can use terminal commands in here. So for instance, pwd is a command that tells you where you are on your computer. So here I'm at C users micwasthad on my computer. ls is a command that will allow you to see all of the files and folders that are at your current location. So you can kind of imagine this as we are in a folder somewhere on our computer, and when we run ls, we get to see everything that's in there. We can run cd to change directory to some folder. So I could cd to my D drive on my computer and see what's there. I can cd into individual folders where I'm located. So if I wanted to go from my D drive into this processing folder, I could cd processing and hit tab and it will auto-complete. And now I'm in that processing folder. I can cd and hit ... to go up a directory. And now I am back at my D folder. And wherever you are currently, your terminal should show you that here. You will see your username and you will see the path where your terminal is currently. So I could cd to C and program files and look in there and see all of the software that I have installed. And you'll notice that if you have a space in a folder or file, you need to escape that with a backslash. So in your terminal window, you should be able to run node-v and see the version of Node that you just installed on your machine. And you should also be able to run npm-v to see the version of npm that you have on your machine. So if those are both printing out versions, then we are good to go and we are able to set up our first React project. I'm going to go ahead and close this window. I actually like to use Windows Terminal, which you can get set up from the Windows App Store. This is non-essential. I just prefer it because of the customization options. You can put custom backgrounds and change the font colors over Git Bash, but it's running Git Bash under the hood here. This is just a user interface for my terminal window, so it functions the same. So I can still do node-v, and I can do npm-v and hit enter and see it printing out. What we want to do is go to a specific folder on our machine where we are saving all of our projects. So mine is in this teaching folder, and we are in Code Sprint A, Week 2, class files. So what we can do here is write cd, and then on Windows and Mac machines, you should be able to drag that folder from Explorer if you're on Windows, or Finder if you're on a Mac. It will paste in that path location, and we can hit enter. So we can now see that we are at that location. So if I'm in class folders, I can see here are the two projects. Here's from the initial video. Here's from our second video that I recorded for this week. And if I do pwd, I should see that path print out. So what we want to do to set up a React application is use a tool that comes from Facebook. And I forgot to mention earlier that React, this library, is built by Facebook. It is an open source library that they've released to the community. So they've also released learning materials and tools for using React. And one of them is called Create React App, which has some nice documentation explaining how to use it. Basically, we are going to set up a very rudimentary React app here. So I am going to run the command. So npx create react app, and be sure that you're typing this exactly as I'm typing it here, case sensitive and everything. And then the folder that we want to save this to. So I'm going to call this React Quiz Game. And when we run this command, it'll take a few minutes, but over here in my class folder where I was CD'd to here, it is going to create a new folder called React Quiz Game and install a bunch of packages. So here it is installing as we speak a bunch of files and packages for us, setting up the scaffold for a React application. So I'm going to pause the video for a second while this finishes. So when that finishes, we can see that it's giving us a set of commands that we can use to actually start up our project. And we're going to ignore this, but we can do this CD. So we can change directory to React dash, and I'm hitting tab to autocomplete quiz game, and I can run ls to see what's in here. You can see node modules, package, public, readme. I also have it open over here. So from over here, I am going to right click and open with code. The other way you can do this is if you want to open up a folder from your terminal in code, as long as you're in that folder, so I'm in React Quiz Game, I can run code dot to open up that folder in Visual Studio Code and close my terminal. Once I'm in Visual Studio, I can see all of the files that were created for me. There's a README, there is something called package.json, there's an src for source folder, there is some CSS in here, some JavaScript, an SVG, some more JavaScript. And what we want to do here is run this application. So what we need is a terminal window, and Visual Studio comes with a terminal window built into it. So from up here, you can hit New Terminal or Control-Shift backtick to pop open a terminal window. And from here, you can configure which shell your terminal, terminal window down here is using. So if you select your default shell, some of these will be recognized for you. If it's not recognized here, you may have to do a little bit of Googling to figure out how to link your shell. But I'm using git bash here as my default so that I'm getting the same environment. I'm able to do ls, I'm able to do pwd, but I can do all of this inside of Visual Studio. And if I hit control backtick, I can toggle this window open and close. So I can use this to run whatever commands I need on the command line and hide it whenever I don't need to see it. So what we want to do is run one of those commands that was being suggested to us. And as a high-level preview, we'll talk more about package.json, but this is a file that describes some of the command line scripts that you have available to you and some of the dependencies, external dependencies, libraries that are brought into this project. So what we want to do is run this start command. And the way that we do that is we make sure we're in our React quiz folder and we run npm run start. And we will see some output here. And our browser window will pop open on localhost 3000. And if I flip back and just show you, it's saying that it's starting up the development server. It is telling us, you can go to this URL to check out your application. And if you want to look at it from another device on your same network, like your mobile phone, you can go to this IP address and this port. So you should hopefully see compiled successfully, and you should see these being printed out in your console window. I'm going to go ahead and close my console window. and pull up my browser and bring this side by side with my code. So here's our basic React app, and it's telling us to edit this app.js file to edit this live version of our code. So I'm going to go over here to app.js, and I'm going to delete what's in this paragraph and say hello React. Save it. And we can see after a second, the changes are mirrored in our browser. So we have this hot reloading that's going on here in the same way when we were using live server. So we can edit this JSX, this JavaScript syntax for authoring HTML, and see some of those changes reflected in the browser. So maybe I get rid of the image, and I'll create an h1 tag and say my first React app, and put an h2 and put my name under there. And we can see all of that changing in the browser. Quick tour of the files that were given here. So we talked about package.json very briefly. It tells us about our dependencies. It gives us some of the scripts that we can run. And then in this src folder, we have some of our source files. And the reason why we call them source files is because remember how I mentioned Node is sometimes used in build pipelines. What's basically happening is our code here that we have in our source file under the hood is processed and then output as final files that could be sent over the wire to someone's browser. Which means taking some of these non-standard features, like this is not vanilla JavaScript. This is not legal code that you can write in just a JavaScript file. So what has to happen is we have to use a build pipeline to turn this into vanilla JavaScript, the sort of equivalent vanilla JavaScript commands. So we have these src files. We have index, which is the starting location, which we can see is doing something with React DOM, which is a library that's being imported, and it is rendering this app component to an element on the page called root. And that is loading this app component that we were looking at here. And this app component imports some CSS. It also brought in a logo that was being used previously, and we can see this app.css, and this is just normal CSS like you would write in the quiz game that we were writing previously that was in just vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We can also look in this public folder, which has a few things like the favicon, but it also has the template for our index.js, our index.html file. So this file you can edit, you can change the title of the application, and here is that div, that element with an ID of root, where our application is being mounted. So this index.html file, our JavaScript file from index.js, is being injected into that file, and that is why we have document.getElement by ID here. So this is a fine template, but actually what we're going to do is blow this away and start fresh. So I'm going to highlight everything just in my src folder and go ahead and delete it. And then what I want to create is a new file called index.js, a new folder called called components, and a new folder called pages. So what I want to do, we'll start in index.js and we'll fill out some of this. We're going to recreate some of that application that we saw before, but we're going to explain the code as we write it line by line. So up at the top here, we are going to import React DOM from React DOM. So you may be wondering, what is React DOM and where did it come from? Because when we've used import before, we've had to specify a path. So if we don't specify a path, what is assumed is that this is an external dependency, that it is something that has been defined in our dependencies here in package.json. We can see it here, version 16.3 0.13.1 or greater is defined as a dependency that we need. And part of what is happening with the scaffolding that we've gotten is that these are coming along for the ride. These have been installed in your computer, on your computer. They're specifically installed in this giant node modules folder inside of your project. So we can import React DOM, which is a library from Facebook, which is responsible for rendering our components to the page. We're also going to need to import React. Any file where we are writing JSX, we have to import React. And let's also grab that root element from the page. So we are doing document.query selector #root. And to make sure that this is working, let's just print out root and make sure that we've got that in our console in our browser. So there we go. We can see root, and here's our HTML loaded, and we can see that empty div root also in the HTML. So to render some JSX to the page, we can just do React DOM dot render and pass in some JSX. So for instance, we could create a main element like we have done in our HTML, and then we could put an h1 element, my first React app, and we could put a paragraph after that, hi there. And as a second parameter, we need to pass in where does this get rendered on the page, and that's where we're going to pass in our root. So this function, this render function, is taking two parameters. One is this markup that we've defined here, and one is this root element. So if we save it, check it out in the browser, we should see our React loading. And so here we can do whatever HTML you're used to doing with maybe a couple little tweaks here and there. And what we can do is define our first component. So a component can be defined in a couple of different ways, but what we're usually going to be defaulting to in this class is a function. A component is simply a function that returns some JSX. So for instance, if we want to refactor this, all we need to do is move this to a function, say that this function returns this JSX, and down here say that we are using our app component. And let's make a tweak so that we can see something different happening in our browser, and save it. And now we can see howdy showing up. So since we haven't done this before, it's worth mentioning that functions can return a value. That means that when that function is invoked, you get something back from it. This is a function here, and it is a function that's built into the browser. When we call it, we get back an HTML element that can be stored. So React is using that to, it's down here when we have app being rendered, it's calling this function and getting this markup and putting it on the page. We can also write this as a self-closing element since there is no content inside of the app, and this will do the same thing. Let's take a look at what a component with props looks like. So we can recreate that example that we saw on the React website where we create a welcome component. So let's call this welcome message, and it can return let's have it return a paragraph. It will have some kind of message like welcome, and into the brackets we are going to put the person's name. So the way this works is that our functions get passed a variable that we can name props, and whatever attributes we set using HTML lingo get set on this props variable. So if I create a welcome message here, welcome message, and I say name equals Mike, this is going to be put onto our props object. So I could see that by printing out props. And we can use that down here by saying props.name. So we should see in our browser a welcome mic, and if we inspect that props object, we should see it has a property called name with a value of mic. And we could reuse this component in multiple places, like we could have a welcome to the class, and that should re-render here and give us a welcome message for Mike and a welcome message for the class. And we can have as many props as we want. So if we wanted to create another one, say greeting, and have that be something that we can assign, so we can say howdy here, and we could say greeting equals good morning here. Get rid of that paragraph. Inside of this variable props is now going to be both a greeting and a name property. So this object we can reach in, and instead of saying welcome, we could say props.greeting. And flip back to our browser, and we can see howdy Mike and good morning class. And if we look at that object that got printed out, we can see it now has two properties in it. It is also common to use our object destructuring that we learned about here. So we can say const greeting name equals props to pull these out into local variables, which shortens up the syntax here to just be greeting and name. Same functionality in the app. Let's talk about styling. So we can bring in some of the CSS that we wrote before. So I'm going to open up a new window so that I can open up the quiz game that we were working on. Oops, that opened up on my other window here. So we had our general CSS. What we're going to do here is create a new file in source called main.css. And into this, we're going to bring some of our code over. So I want to bring, from main.css, I want to bring our font import that we had on this first line. So I'm going to copy that, paste that in here, save it. And I'm also going to bring in our code that we had in general.css. But I'm going to omit some of the stuff at the bottom here. So I really just want the HTML body and hyperlink styling. So I'm going to bring those over. And we can get rid of this emoji list. We'll see another place that we can put this later. So this should give us some of the font and body styling that we had going on in our app before. If we look at our application, none of this is being added to the page just yet. So what we have to do in this new workflow is in index.js, go ahead and import that file, main.css. And if we check that out, we should see, forgot to bring over the images. So what I want to do is create a new folder here for our images. And let's grab from the code sprint. Grab both of these while we're at it, paste them in here, and then we need to modify our path to these images now. So main is no longer sitting in a CSS folder, so we no longer have to go up a directory here. We can just say /images to indicate that we are in the same directory. We are just moving over to the images folder, and save this and check it out. And now we've got our background, and we've got our fonts loading, and we've got our font sizing, and that text is in a centered container again. So let's say we wanted to add some styling for our welcome message. We wanted to give this a class so that maybe it loaded in a bigger font size or something along those lines. One of the things that we're going to have to do in working in React is learn that instead of doing class equals something, we're going to say class name equals something. So for instance, we could say class name equals welcome message, save it, and if we went back to our CSS, hop down to the bottom and said welcome message font size 2 rem and save it and come back, we can see that our font size changed. Let me have these side by side so we can see it live. 1.5, 1.25. Okay, so let's finish this up by reorganizing some of our code here. So I'm going to close my styling, close this. So one of the things that is going to be common for us to do is all of our components are going to sit in their own files. So instead of having index.js with all of this in one file, we're going to put each of these in a separate file inside of components. So I'm going to create a new file here called app.js and a new file here called welcome-message.js. And what I want to do is take this app, and instead of having it be in here, cut this, paste it into app, and back into index, grab my welcome message, paste it into welcome message. And this is great, except that remember, each of these files is its own domain, so its own scope, which means that inside of index, we can no longer refer to app. And if I open up my console window, we can see that it failed to compile, and it tells me that there's an error on line 7 in index.js that it doesn't know what app is. And if I look at my browser, it's also really helpfully piping the errors to the browser so we can see them here. So what we need to do is go back through these files that we just created and do the right import and export structure. So I'm going to start with welcome message, and I'm going to bring this console down a little bit. We're going to keep it handy so that we can see when it starts working again. But I'm just going to minimize it a little bit. So anytime we are creating JSX in a file, we need to import React from React. And then when we are finished with our writing our component here, we need to export default welcome message. So now welcome message, this function, is accessible to anyone that imports this file. So let's flip over to app. So app, we need to do a similar thing. Let's go ahead and import React from React. And we want to export app, or export default app. We're going to run into a problem here because welcome message, it doesn't know what welcome message is in this file. So if we want to be able to use welcome message in here, we now have to do an import. So we have to import welcome message from, and we want to grab it from our welcome message file. And unlike in the browser where we had to specify the extension .js, we don't have to do that when we are in the create React setup here. So we're importing this function here. So this is no longer undefined. It knows what this is. So now we can come back to index and we can go ahead and import app from components app. I'm going to reorder this slightly. So inside of index, we're going to have to go into this components folder where we've saved app and welcome message to be able to access it. And when we're inside of app and we're importing welcome message, we're in the same folder, so we can just have a // to import the welcome message. So we save it. We should be able to see it in our browser working again. And that's enough of an introduction to start with React. When we go into the next video, we are going to start taking our application that we built in vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and start porting it to this structure where we're going to leverage React to build our components in a new way and to build them in arguably a more maintainable way that makes it easier for us to build larger scale applications. And I am cutting in with one quick note at the end just to clarify. So our application, all of this code is only available when we have our terminal window running that npm run start command. So if I go into my terminal window and hit Control-C to kill that, or if I hit this little trash icon to kill the terminal, and I go back to my browser and refresh it, this is going to crash. It's going to try and connect for a few seconds and then say that there's nothing there at localhost 3000. So if you close your application or you close Visual Studio and you open it up again and expect to see your application, you're not going to see it until you run npm run start again. And this will go ahead and rerun the application, start up the development server, get your local host running on port 3000. And as you're developing, you should always pop open this window from time to time if something has gone wrong to check if there are any errors. If you see compiled successfully, then the code that you wrote at least doesn't have any compile errors. And then you'll want to open up your browser if something is going funky and check your console to make sure that there are no console errors. Okay, that's it for this video. See you in the next one.